You wouldn't guess by knowing me today, but I didn't grow up in a very loving family. My parents had me, of course, but I'm pretty sure I wasn't anything planned or intentional. They had their lives, and I just got the feeling from an early age that I was just in their way. I'm not saying that they didn't love me or anything, but they certainly weren't the sort of parents that said it or showed it very much. When I look back at it, they always seemed like they were preoccupied by something, like something else was always on their minds, and I knew it wasn't me. My memories of that time seem cold and dark, not real safe and warm. Sometimes when they were gone, I'd wonder if they were coming back at all, or if I'd ever see them again. One Christmas, though, they actually got me a video game system complete with a bunch of different games to play. That was a big deal. But that became my solace, my retreat. That's where I started kind of living in my own little world, as my own hero. I started living in my head. My parents had a tendency to argue and yell a lot. I couldn't tell you what they were arguing about, but playing video games just seemed like a simpler and safer place to be. I know my dad drank, and I know my mom didn't like that. That much I'm certain of. As time went by and I got older, I started to realize how complicated things really were between them. But as a child, I didn't get it. I also began to understand that at our house, a home-cooked meal was a very rare event. I went to school and did okay, made friends and all that, and found out some of my friends had homes just like mine. These kids weren't necessarily on the honor roll or anything, but then again, neither was I. We really did just enough to get by. As I grew older, I hated being at home and I found myself hanging around my friends more and more, and distance grew between me and my parents. My friends and I became a support group for one another. We laughed and we cried together. Who better to understand your problems than somebody going through nearly the exact same thing? You could say we were kids just being kids, but sooner than later, drugs and alcohol started making their way into our groups. At first, it seemed like a good way to have fun, forget about our problems and not feel bad about stuff all the time. But really, it was only a momentary escape. Then, it seemed to grab a hold of me, like it was calling me and telling me to go get more and do more, whatever it was. I chased after it, and by then, it had me. There weren't any adults looking after us, so who cares, right? In our minds, and to ourselves, we were cool. I began to realize these friends of mine were becoming more of a family than anything I'd ever experienced before. The only problem is nobody had any real wisdom to share. We were getting high, hanging out, listening to music, messing around with girls, partying. It was all good. Or so we thought. Ironically, even though things seemed good, inside I was angry and confused that my parents didn't even notice I was gone. Then one day they sat me down and told me they were getting a divorce. I didn't really know what to do or what to think at first. I felt numb to it all. I felt empty and afraid. Then I got angry, but I tried my best to keep it all inside. That's when the drugs got harder, when my life did. But I still really hadn't seen anything yet. After I OD'd and they revived me back from death, I woke up on a hospital bed. I felt trapped in my own life and I couldn't get out. I was still just a teenager. My parents came together to see me in the hospital, but I can't remember ever seeing them again in the same room. After I got discharged from the hospital and my near-death experience, my mom took me to a rehab. Some kids go to college, I went to rehab. This cycle of drugs, ODs, and rehabs continued on for several years until a rather unfortunate set of circumstances landed me in some serious trouble. Let's just say my court case was something you wouldn't want to wish on your worst enemy. I had created a record of criminal activity over time, but this was a big charge. You know, it doesn't really matter what the charge was. All that matters is that I was looking at some serious time. No overnight drunk tank kind of stuff here. My parents didn't have the money or desire to hire a big attorney, so instead, I got a public defender. You can figure out the rest. Up the river, catching a chain, whatever you want to call it, I was going away for a while. Calling jails and prisons correctional facilities would suggest that there's some correction involved. That's really not true. It's meant to be punishment, and that's what it is, so let's not mince words here. My dignity, self-respect, and privacy were taken away from me quickly, and the other things that prison robbed me of can't be mentioned in mixed company. I felt lonely, isolated, scared, and all those feelings were compounded with the claustrophobic clanging of bars and cells all the time. Still, there's a longing somewhere to try to fit in, if only for survival purposes. My mom put some money in my books, which is to say I could buy extra food and hygiene stuff, so that was a good thing. Friends became allies and then gang members, and a pair of lips will say anything. In other words, it's real hard to trust people. My view of humanity was diminished along with my view of myself. Bottom line is, you don't want to go there. I hope that much is clear. One day, though, a preacher man came into my pod and held a church service for us inmates where he talked about some ideas of hope, forgiveness. It all sounded pretty good to a dumb-luck criminal like me. The message stuck. I even got a Bible. I was moved. I wanted to learn more, but I didn't want anybody thinking that I was better than them or whatever. It was a message I needed to hear, and I never forgot that day. I guess you could say a seed was planted. So I finally finished my time and I got let out on parole. Really, I should have been happier about it, but I didn't have much to go back to. My mother had remarried, and this new guy wasn't about to let me move in with them. Looking back, I can't really say that I blame the guy, but still. I stayed in a bunch of halfway houses, applied to a ton of jobs, and went to a number of 12-step meetings just trying to meet the requirements of my parole. Really, it was like being a slave to a master that really doesn't care about you or want anything to do with you except take your money and lord over you and boss you around. Those were my feelings at the time anyway. I felt helpless with my criminal record hanging over me. I felt lonely, alienated, and dead inside. I just couldn't do it anymore. I had no connection with this world I found myself in. I went back to drinking, and then of course, other things. I found myself in homeless shelters, soup kitchens, and inevitably on the streets. I started seeing the same people after a while, and we actually started looking out for one another. At the end of the day, though, it's a miserable existence. I hadn't felt that low since prison. A lot of emotions and thoughts would pass through my mind throughout the days. Anxiety, depression, desperation, and fiending for a buzz or a fix or something, anything. I'd go into a restaurant or store to cool off or warm up, but I'd get kicked out. I might have to use the bathroom outside somewhere using napkins from some store. Hygiene is basically out the window. Not a real option most of the time. I think that's where I started to draw the line. Later, on a particular day, no different from the rest really, I was lounging around with some of my buddies in our familiar spot, and along comes this guy talking about Jesus. He sure didn't look like a preacher I had ever seen. I mean, he was wearing a hoodie and tennis shoes, but he sure knew his Bible. He asked me some questions that seemed to read my mail, if you know what I mean. Anyway, he said, and I quote, "I have some hope for you, brother, and it's in Jesus. We got love and family, and all happens at this place called the Denton Freedom House." Well, that place is where I was introduced to my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ in the most mighty of ways. And right then, the trajectory of my life changed forever. I got a real taste of freedom, and I'm never going back.